The arts have many homes and functions in society. We're going to now consider the arts and religion. For this, we're going to be focusing on three specific religions that are common throughout the world: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And there is historically an interesting link between these three religions. They are all referred to as Abrahamic religions. In other words, they trace their origins back to the character of Abraham and Sarah. God gave Abraham a promise that a great nations would emerge from his lineage. And so the promise was made in Judaism. The promise is also claimed in Islam and also in Christianity. But these three religions do have rich traditions in the arts, so we're going to be looking at these three. We'll begin by considering the place of the arts in Islam. Within Islam, there are three major areas where the arts are manifest. One is architecture, one is calligraphy, and one is music. With the architecture, there is a consistent plan or structure that mosques follow, and that's known as central plan architecture. This is in contrast to Western European style basilica architecture. With central plan, if you can imagine everything in worship happening around a central hub, a point in the middle of a circle. All the other functions of the mosque would occur either outside the circle or around the periphery of the circle, but the worship itself is in the center. It's circular. And if you look at the outside of a mosque, or if you have the opportunity to go into a mosque, you do see this circular structure where things are traveling around a central point, an axis, so to speak. We also have domes. Domes resemble the curve of heaven and the night sky if you look up into a dome when you are standing underneath it. Domes also have an acoustical function where they will help to focus the sound back down towards the leader of worship and the faithful followers who are worshiping in that moment. And so, in the case of domes, it reduces the need for other forms of amplification. And historically, it was the only amplification that was possible prior to electronic amplification methods. We also see geometric embellishment. This is very important because in a mosque, you will never see portraits of people. You will never see a portrait of Muhammad, for example. You will never see images of animals. This goes back to a concept known as Shreya Law. And in Sharia law, it's a religious law that is based on the Quran. And in the Quran, it's forbidden to create graven images. In other words, to put yourself in the place of God, essentially, by creating these images of animals and people. And so you do not see in a mosque, again, portraits of Muhammad, as you might see prophets and central figures of other religions in other settings. But geometric embellishment is actively embraced. It's very beautiful. It resembles nature. It resembles the rhythm and the structures of nature, and so it's used frequently. For example, you may have a dome, and the inside of the dome might be decorated with a beautiful geometric pattern. So this is a lot of what's going on with architecture with the mosques. For calligraphy, the beauty of writing, the artistry of writing, was used to decorate the sacred manuscripts, the Quran, and also the walls of mosques at some time. Sometimes there may be the names of God that is venerated in Islam that are written on the walls using this very beautiful script calligraphy. But again, with calligraphy we find another practice known as illumination, where the manuscripts, the Qurans, it's a very ancient technique, are hand-copied, but then additional elements might be added to further beautify it. Again, geometric patterns, or perhaps something resembling plants from nature. The third area, primary area of the arts in Islam is music. and it's known especially coming from the muezzin, who is the music leader, who creates the call to worship. Historically, a muezzin would ascend a tower that is connected to the mosque, and 5 times a day, using a call to worship song, would call the faithful followers to the mosque for worship. So again, music is there. It is vocal. It is not instrumental in terms of religious activity. Throughout the Middle East, certainly you will hear all forms of instrumental music. But in terms of worship, it's vocal and it's led by the muezzin. Here's a photograph of the Basilica Mosque in Cairo. And as you look at the central portion of the mosque, over on the left side, you will see the beautiful dome. You will also see the external part of the dome being decorated by geometric patterns in the stone work. And look also at other parts of the mosque. The tower to the right, where the muezzin would ascend and give the call to worship 5 times a day, again for the faithful followers of Islam to come and worship. Now, you'll also notice that while there is a dome and there appears to be an area that's circular underneath the dome for worship, much of the rest of the mosque is squared off and built off. Those are probably administrative offices and other kinds of rooms where other functions of the mosque could take place. And those functions could include public feeding programs to help the indigent and people who are down on their luck. It could include education, where people are, in addition to the worship service, are trained in the matters of the Quran. But again, this is a very old mosque, but you can see the notion of the central plan. You can see the non-representational decoration or ornamentation on the surface of the buildings and the towers, and you can also see the dome. This is an architectural drawing for a new mosque that's being created in Kuwait. It's the Fatima Mosque. And again, even though it is a very modern and new mosque, in contrast to the Basilica Mosque in Cairo, it still is containing these elements. Look at the central area of worship that you see directly in front of you. The large conics type section with the symbol of Islam, the crescent moon at the top. We also have the tall tower where the call to worship would be led. In contemporary days, in modern days, it's not necessary for the muezzin to ascend to the top of the tower. The call to worship can be given electronically through a loudspeaker system. It's more efficient, it projects better over greater distances, and it is a way that Islam has integrated contemporary technology in worship. But again, notice some things. Notice the geometric patterns. On the central portion of the mosque itself, the dome of the mosque, notice those particular patterns. They do resemble something that is from nature. They look like very large seed pods of some type. Also notice the colors of green, the color of life. There's a great deal of symbolism that is imbued in color throughout all religions, and it's being acknowledged here through this central dome. Again, this is the plans for the Fatima Mosque in Kuwait that is being built. Here is the interior of a dome looking upwards in the Sheikh Loft Allah Mosque in Iran. Notice the phenomenal amount of geometric patterning that goes on, the small little mosaics forming together to create a much larger image. And again, this is typical of older historic domes that you would find within mosques. There is symmetry, there is balance. The entire dome is a mirror reflection of itself as it progresses around. And there's also, if you look very carefully, there's also some calligraphy on the walls, probably telling stories or recounting sacred scriptures from the Quran. This is a copy of a 14th century Quran, a Quran from the Middle Ages. And again, calligraphy is found in Qurans and also mosque walls, especially if a mosque decided to put some of the sacred names of God on their walls as a form of reverence towards Allah. But you'll notice in this particular copy of the Quran, the text is in the middle of the page. But do notice the beautiful decoration and ornamentation known as illumination on the tops and the bottoms, creating a framing or creating a context of some type for the text that's there. And again, this process of illumination is found through numerous religions. It goes back to the days where only hand calligraphy could be used to create copies of books before we had printing presses. And even today, calligraphy is still a highly valued and prized art form, and for very special things it is still done by hand. Let's think a little bit about this whole beautification of the page. Imagine for a moment that you are a follower of Islam and you have the opportunity to read from the Quran, this decorated Quran. The beautification of it gives a special sense of purpose and reverence to what's going on the page. And it helps to draw you in the sense that it gives you the feeling of a privilege to have such a beautiful book to read from as part of your worship. And again, this is not limited to Islam. We have illuminated manuscripts also in Judaism and Christianity as well. Again, emerging primarily from the 14th century, from the Middle Ages, before the printing press. Here we have two museum curators examining a Quran from the Middle Ages at the Walters Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. To the right, we have one of the curators using a small flashlight to look at something very carefully on the Quran. This particular Quran, you'll notice that the physical size of the book is quite large. The folios, the leaves that the Quran was created on typically are very large. Even though it's some distance away, we can still see the calligraphy and we can see what's known as the illumination, that decoration that reflected the geometric designs and also reflected scenes from nature as well. But again, no humans, no depictions of Muhammad, and no animals would be seen in a Quran, because that would be putting the artist in the place of essentially serving as a god to create an image, and that is forbidden by the Quran. Now let's consider Judaism. In Judaism, you have three main areas of artistic manifestation in the worship of God, and that is the architecture itself, the architecture of the synagogue. This is the artwork that we inhabit. This is the artwork in which we find meaning and connection for our purpose. But again, the architecture of the synagogue. There's calligraphy and painting, and that is seen in sacred manuscripts, in illuminated manuscripts, and in the Torah. The Torah being the sacred book of Judaism, and it focuses especially on the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, which were written down by Moses to give the Jewish people a history and a written account of who they were, where they came from, and the laws and various processes for worshiping God in a proper way. And then we also have music. Now, with contemporary Judaism, there can be other art forms that enter into the worship of God. However, these are the traditional core of art forms that we see. Now, with calligraphy, it's the same deal with Islam. There are illuminated manuscripts, and the calligraphy itself is very beautiful. And there's also some interesting traditions of calligraphy. For example, when a new synagogue is built, as part of the final christening or the final dedication of the synagogue, the very last few lines of the Torah are completed by the rabbi and by perhaps other members of the synagogue and part of a dedication ceremony. So the Torah would include everything up to maybe the last sentence of the Torah. And so it's a symbolic act of completion, and it is a way to engage the congregation itself and the rabbi who will be serving that synagogue at this very important juncture in this congregation's life. But in addition to calligraphy, there's also painting. You do have mural paintings and wall paintings, but these paintings, unlike Islam, do include people and animals, and quite often will recount important points of history in Judaism. And again, the architecture of a synagogue can either be basilica-based or central plan-based. In this particular synagogue, this is a synagogue in Riga, Latvia, it is basilica-based. And the place that the synagogue got a lot of these is because historically, if you go back to ancient Rome, the synagogues and the Roman buildings were coming from the same time period and being built for the same simple functions and purposes, and because of this, they mimicked the architecture of one another. In fact, there were many times where Jewish congregations were able to take over or were able to acquire buildings that had been built for another purpose. Now, the Basilica Style works very well for Judaism because there is an old traditional practice of men sitting on one side of the synagogue and women sitting on the other. And so that's very easy to see how this could be carried out very easily in this synagogue in Riga, Latvia. You have two sets of balconies and you have two sets of seating areas on the main floor. At the central part, the area of the altar where the worship is taking place, it's in the center of it, and it creates a beautiful symmetry between both sides of this particular synagogue. Here we have a synagogue in Toronto. On the altar area, we have the menorah, the candelabra, which is representative of the practices of faith in certain holidays. We also have large symbols or heralds. Those large flags that you see in back of the altar go back to a practice of the Middle Ages of creating what's known as heralds, which are large plaques or flags that would be displayed, sharing information about your family lineage. In this particular case, those particular heralds have to do with the history of this particular synagogue. There's also a couple of other things that you'll see on the area in back of the altar area. One is you'll see a pair of Star of Davids, the 6-pointed star instead of the 5-pointed star. There is symbolism in this particular configuration of a star in Judaism. It is the joining together of two triangles, one pointing upwards and one pointing downwards. It is the symbol for the combining of heaven and earth, heaven pointing upwards and earth pointing downwards. And so it's also known as the Star of Solomon, and goes back to those historic times as well. But something else I want you to notice. Notice the stained glass windows on the top allowing light. When we think of stained glass windows, quite often we see examples from Christianity in the Middle Ages. But stained glass is also found in Judaism as well, going back to the Middle Ages in the synagogues at those times. So again, I did not put that in this particular list of artistic manifestations because I was considering the stained glass as an extension of painting, as a way of using light and glass to beautify and decorate this particular house of worship. So again, calligraphy and painting, very, very important in Judaism. And here we have two examples. If we look to the right, we see what's known as a Huggable Manuscript. This is an illuminated manuscript. You see the text in the central lower part. But then we also have the story of Haggadah and particular individuals and prophets who are very closely associated with it, all pictured around the text that is in the central. Again, this is known as the process of illumination, and it goes back to the Middle Ages. On the left side, we have a contemporary mural painting from the B'nai B'rith Jacob Synagogue in New Jersey, and it again includes the elements of Judaism in a very interesting mural. Mural paintings and paintings on walls and even using images of people in stained glass in Judaism and Christianity goes back to the Middle Ages, times when, otherwise known as the Dark Ages, times when things were very bleak and difficult for people, and there was a lot of illiteracy Most of the people who could read and write were affiliated with churches or with synagogues or with mosques. The common people did not have a level of literacy that they do today. But you can see several symbols in this particular mural. We have the menorah in the middle. We also have a Torah, a scroll, in the lower right-hand corner. In the upper left-hand corner, we have an interesting book. It is an illuminated manuscript, and it's interesting because that text block in the center is the actual scripture that is to be considered, and then there's some blocks of text around it which are commentary that rabbis have provided over centuries, and these are passed down as teachings for the faithful of Judaism. On the right-hand side, in the upper right-hand corner, there is a serving tray with a lot of small dishes on it. This is known as a Satyr Platter, and this is a ceremonial plate that is prepared at the time of Passover, and it contains different food elements that remind the Jewish people about what their life was like in captivity as slaves in Egypt before they were liberated. There's also one other interesting item on this particular image. If you look to the left of the menorah, you will see a hand creating a V-shaped with the V split in the middle. That is actually, in popular culture, that is a symbol that was appropriated and used in the old series of Star Trek, and it was ostensibly a Vulcan symbol of peace and greeting. But actually, it is an ancient Jewish symbol, which again is the same idea, a greeting of peace, and it's a hand gesture that would be used among Jewish people in ancient times. But again, that is coming from, it's a practice coming from Judaism, and they were able to include this in this particular mural. So now we come to Christianity, and Christianity historically is probably one of the more diverse religions in terms of integration of the artwork, because Christianity borrowed artwork from various sources. It borrowed it from Judaism, it borrowed practices theologically, religiously, in terms of the way the ceremonies would be carried out from Judaism. It also borrowed things that were very beautiful from everyday life, of the non-sacred, of the secular as well, but repurposed it for sacred purposes of worship. So we have architecture, we have sculpture and painting, we have calligraphy, we have theater, we have dance, and we have music. For cathedrals and churches in Christianity, there is both the Basilica Style and central plan influence, although Basilica is predominant. But in these great cathedrals, stained glass became a common practice in these massive cathedrals. There is a difference between a church and a cathedral. A church can be as large or as small as it needs to be, but cathedrals historically are specifically the home of the bishop, who is the leader and the overseer of the priests of a particular region. So cathedrals typically had more financial resources, and because of that they were very, very large, and they housed a lot of art. But the stained glass windows are known primarily for cathedrals. And again, the Basilica style, the long shoebox style, instead of the central plan circular style, is featured in Christian churches quite often. Although it is possible to find Christian churches building on central plan influence. Sculpture and painting. Key figures from the Bible and prophets are created and presented historically to remind people who could not read of the different champions of the religion of Christianity along the time. But we do have sculpture and painting. We have calligraphy, illuminated manuscripts. We have theater, morality plays. There was a point in the Middle Ages where the church was trying to reach out to the communities, and so they began having morality plays. People enjoy theater, and they'd have these morality plays outdoors, usually on the steps of the cathedrals or churches, and it would encourage people to come into church and to hear more of the sermons and to participate in worship. But these morality plays emerged during this time period in the Middle Ages. There's also dance, liturgical dance. It's usually an interpretive dance form. We might call it modern dance because the gestures appear to be similar in some respects to contemporary modern dance. that we have in the secular world, but again, liturgical dance, which is evocative or interpretive of sacred scriptures. And music is interesting because music has evolved over time in the same way that music has evolved in time, and has reflected the local communities and the cultures. The music of the church, the Christian church, has also evolved in the same way. So here's an overview of a Basilica Style cathedral. This particular cathedral is in Bulgaria, and it was built at the very end of the Middle Ages. It's what we refer to as a Western style, Western European style architecture. It is again that long, elongated kind of shoebox architecture. There's also something known as a transept. The symbol of the cross for the crucifixion of Jesus is prominent in Christianity, and so churches at a certain point begin adding transepts to their buildings. A small rectangular unit that would cross over the main body of it. And if one were to look from the correct angle, it would resemble a cross. In this particular diagram, we see this black dots. Those are major pillars that help support the walls in the church. But if you go down to the far right, we have three little bumps, or three alcoves. Those are niches, and those are where paintings or sculptures of important figures would be placed. And that would include, for example, the figure of Christ, of Jesus. That might also include Mary or Joseph, the parents of Jesus. It might include prophets of God, such as old biblical prophets or contemporary, in that day, modern prophets, somebody like John the Baptist who foretold the coming of Jesus. But again, this is Basilica Style architecture. Here we have a cathedral in Pisa, Italy, and this is known as the Duomo. Duomo in Italian means dome, and right in the center you will see the dome that is covering the area where the transept intersects, where the body and the arms of the transept cut together. And again, remember the acoustical functions and functions of beautification of the dome still carrying through in this particular cathedral. You'll notice it's very ornate on the outside. It's also a very ornate cathedral on the inside. As we stand here on this plaza looking in towards this particular cathedral, it's multi-layered or multi-storied. A very tall main floor, and then other floors that go up, eventually creating the roof line. You can also see the windows that allow light to go in as well. And again, this is Basilica Style architecture. It's based on the old Roman basilicas, those long civic and public buildings that were sort of shoebox-like in their nature. But it's very elaborated and very expanded upon for the purposes of the religion. And again, this is a cathedral. It's very large, it's ornate, it has resources because this is the seat or the home of the bishop who has theological and leadership responsibilities for all the priests in a particular region. So this is the church where the bishop holds residence. In the Catholic Church, there are different layers. There are lay people, worshipers. There are priests. There are bishops. Another layer is the cardinals, who have supervisory responsibilities over the bishops. And then there is the Pope. This is a section of illuminated manuscript, again from the 14th century. And this is a section that is speaking of Peter, one of the followers of Jesus. There are symbols that he's holding in his hands. In his right hand, as we see it on his left, but his right, there's something that looks like a big ancient key. This is, again, coming from sacred scriptures, and it's referring to Peter as being the holder of the key, and given the responsibility of keys to various types of spiritual matters. There's also the book that he wrote, the writings, in his left hand. You'll notice there is a halo around him. Halos are common in Christian worship, and halos indicate some type of spiritual presence or spiritual attributes. The language of this particular text is Latin. That was the language of the church in the Middle Ages. But you will see, again, this very beautiful illustration of Peter, as well as the calligraphy that surrounds it. Now, and again, contrast that to the calligraphy and the illuminated manuscript that you would see of a Quran, where there is no picturing of an individual or an animal because of Shreya law. So we have seen the place and function of the arts in three major world religions, three Abrahamic religions. We've seen the place and function of the arts of sampling in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. All of this comes together to further show us how the arts are integrated into our being and our society. And again, all of these art forms have long, ancient traditions that are carried through even today.